My name is Amy Mabius, and I'm the Best Practice Coordinator at Community Access to Recovery Services. This year, and welcome, new change agents, and welcome to our change agents who have been here over and over and over again. It's always nice to see everybody, and happy spring. This year, we have been focusing on how to keep ourselves inspired, motivated, and passionate about the work we do to encourage a ricochet effect that spreads throughout our behavioral health system. We usually spend our time focusing on our 9 MC3 values, learning about what it means to be co-occurring and the importance of continuous quality improvement. We don't spend a lot of time talking about how we individually make a difference. This has been an exciting year creating our own ripple effect as change agents. I do have a couple of things to bring to your attention. The first thing I'd like to mention is that one of our change agents, our very precious change agents, Jane Johnston, has passed away over the weekend. You may have known Jane as a change agent or known her that she sat on the MC3 steering committee meetings, or from outreach and retention committee meetings. She was a very special person, very kind-hearted and loving, and we just loved having her as a change agent. I'm wondering if we could spend just a moment thinking about Jane and thinking some positive thoughts to send her on her next journey. I'll give us just a moment. At this time, there are no arrangements. The best place and the best person to reach out to for those arrangements will be Mary Neubauer. After I get done with announcements, somebody please remind me to put Mary Neubauer's email in the chat so that I can remember to do that. And that way, if you do have questions of how to get a hold of Mary and ask about further details about Jane's arrangements, you can do so. You may have heard me talking a little bit about the MC3 listserv. That's just the emails that go out as a reminder of the MC3 change agent meetings. I've had some complaints because people keep getting kicked off for whatever reason. We have a new listserv. The one thing that you should know, it's not Constant Contact that you're getting anymore. It won't come from me. It comes from Milwaukee Cars. And if for whatever reason you get kicked off, just a reminder that the MC3 Change Agent website is always available to you. And you no longer have to put .com or .org or anything in. You literally can just Google MC3 Milwaukee. And I think I'm going to see if I can share my screen real quick here. Let me see if I can. Okay. So if you Google MC3 Milwaukee, this is what's going to come up. You're going to see the homepage. This is our very first page. And the first thing that you're going to see is the next event that's happening. So today you'll see that today we're going to be talking about caring for yourself as you care for others. And it will actually have the link of how to join. And if it just happens to be in person, then that information will be here as well. And so if you go into the events tab, which is the next one over, you'll see all the events that are coming up. And today, like for example, our presenter has given me permission to record. So therefore, you'll find the recording for this right down in the April spot. It will be somewhere right down here with the certificate of attendance that will be here. And as we look towards May 22nd, you're going to notice that we have a building resiliency workshop. If you remember, MC3 is going to be virtual in the wintertime, and then we get more in person as the weather warms up. Building resiliency actually will be at Zufari next month on the 22nd, and that information will be forthcoming. So I'll come back to you now. If everybody could just mute their microphone for me, please. Let me see if I could do that real quick. Let me see if I can find the.
Carrie is not muted. Amy, you're muted now.
Now I'm muted. Okay, thanks. Thank you, everybody. See, this is why we're change agents. We just help each other out, right? So, okay, so I've already talked that the May change agent meeting will be at the zoo. Now, it's important to note that we won't be inside the zoo like we were for Tales for the Zoo. We'll be at the Zufari Conference Center, and that's right outside the zoo. It's conference center that kind of sits next to the zoo. The address will be on the list, the email that goes out. A reminder that next year the theme is Chef's Choice. So we get to choose, the change agents get to choose what they would like to learn about. And so I already have gotten some suggestions and have started reaching out to the people that I have been given ideas about. So if you just keep them coming, because the more ideas I get, the more opportunities for change agents we'll have next year, change agent meetings we'll have for next year. So, okay, let's see what else. I have a whole bunch of different things for you. Okay, so our theme, the ripple effect, leads us to our speaker today. And we'll be talking about caring for yourself as you care for others, the ripple effect of sustaining staff well-being as a pathway to quality improvement with Dr. Leslie Ann Ross, who's on the call right now.
Hi, everybody.
Yes. Oh,
I just said hi. Go ahead.
Yes, no, you're doing great. Okay. For more than 2 decades, Dr. Ross has overseen programs in research, training, implementation of evidence-based practices in trauma-informed care for children and families at Children's Institute. Dr. Ross has also served as the director of core curriculum on childhood trauma implementation and training at the UCLA Duke University. Dr. Ross was the co-founder of the NCTSN Secondary Traumatic Stress Collaborative Group, which continues to focus on prevention and intervention of secondary traumatic stress associated with reducing the risk of provider distress. She co-authored the Secondary Traumatic Stress Inventory and the Secondary Traumatic Stress Organizational Change Framework Model, as well as a number of journal articles on secondary traumatic stress. Dr. Ross is currently working as a core curriculum on childhood trauma, faculty trainer for the National Child Trauma Workforce Institute. She also works nationally as an independent consultant, speaker, and trainer on trauma-informed care, reducing the risk of secondary traumatic stress, and building a resilient workforce. So please, everyone, you can use your emojis if you'd like, or even use your speaker to say welcome if you'd like to help me welcome Dr. Leslie Ann Ross. And this means, Dr. Ross, you have the floor.
Okay. Thank you so much, Amy. And hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm very excited to be here today with all of you. And I hope that, I know this is a long training, but I'm hoping that you'll be able to walk away with some new strategies and ideas for yourself, for your team, and your workplace that will support your well-being. Thank you, everybody. All right, I am going to go ahead and see if I can pull up my PowerPoint. I usually facilitate trainings via Zoom, so this is a little bit of a stretch for me, but I'm going to do my best.
Let me know if you need help. It looks like it's just fine.
Okay, all right.
Do you want to see if you can advance one slide and I can tell you if it's going?
Well, I'm sharing my, oh, okay. Let's see. Woohoo. Okay, I did it. All right.
Good.
So Amy, thank you for that wonderful introduction. You did a great job of reading that mouthful of words. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the work that I've done over the last, well, many decades as we go along. But I'm also really interested in all of you. And I know that we don't have time to do introductions for everyone, but what would be helpful for me, and I think Amy's going to support me with this, if you don't mind just writing in the chat what kind of work you do and how many years you've been in the field. So this is really important to me because in different times in our career and in our pathway, we experience what I'm going to talk about as provider distress in many different ways. And there's certain points in our career that tend to be particular times of vulnerability. So it's valuable to know that. So what kinds of things are coming up, Amy? Because I can't see the chat.
Can you see that? Clinical compliance, program manager, 8 years in the behavioral health field, 13 years. Gosh, it goes so fast when they do start coming in. 29 years in social services,
Oh, wow,
therapist,
great.
10 years, director, 33, field,
Wow.
24 years. Oh, it's going so fast. I apologize, guys, if I'm not doing this right. Agency administrator, IPS program supervisor, 30 plus years in social services, a 20 years social worker, 11 years employment, 9 years with youth, a substance use mental health therapist, clinical coordinator, supervisor, CCS, ancillary provider, parenting, 32 years in
So it
social
sounds like
services.
a lot of these folks have years of experience. This is very exciting. Are there people on the call who are students in graduate education or early career professionals that are joining us today?
There should be, and it wouldn't surprise me one bit if you'll get some. Would you like them to drop it in the chat?
Sure. I'm just curious because what you've been sharing has been
You've
folks
got
that have
one
been
in
doing
grad
amazing
school
work
so
for.
far.
Oh, good.
Sorry to interrupt you, Leslie.
No, go ahead.
One says graduating this summer.
Wonderful.
Coordinator director, new community wellness coach. I'm just reading them as they come.
Anybody in juvenile justice or in the military?
Background supervisor. I just started care coordination. Currently in grad school, care coordinator, almost 3 years. Military veteran.
Great. Great. Okay, well, that's really helpful. It sounds like we have a huge range of people joining us today. So I will do my best to try and make this relevant to all of you. I'm going to go ahead here to the next slide. So I want to take a minute by way of introduction of my work to talk a little bit about the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. And I don't know if any of you, and again, I'm not going to be able to really see this, but I don't know if any of you are familiar with NCTSN, have ever heard of it. We are a SAMHSA-funded network of organizations across the country that are doing work, this is our mission statement, to raise the standard of care, improve the access to services for traumatized children and families in communities throughout the United States. So we have over 200 community mental health, child welfare, universities, educators, really all kinds of organizations across the country that are funded grantees. And what's different about NCTSN is folks who get these grants actually are required to work collaboratively, right, to support each other in furthering this work. The NCTSN started in 2001 from a federal initiative to improve care for children experiencing trauma, children and families. And so we've been around for quite a while. I first participated when I first joined Children's Institute in Los Angeles, which is a large community mental health organization. In 2002 was when I started. And it's been a wonderful experience to be able to work with folks, as I said, across the country. And some of that work happens in what we call collaborative groups, which are voluntary groups where people come together to focus on specific issues. So my colleague, Jenny Sprang, who's at University of Kentucky, she and I started a collaborative group on secondary traumatic stress in 2009. And since then, we and a number of other people have really focused on understanding the impact of a number of risk factors for providers as they're doing their work, and how it not only impacts individuals, because we're very good at saying, you know, eat more kale, go take a bubble bath, make sure you're getting enough exercise. And of course, all those things are important for our well-being, but that's not enough really to address this issue of some of the stress that we experience on our job, on the job. So I will be sharing some NCTSN resources and some of the work that Ginny is currently doing with her site at University of Kentucky as well as we move along. So why are we here together today? I like to use this quote. This is from Rachel Naomi Remen from her book, Kitchen Table Wisdom. And she says, the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. And I really feel like this quote sets the context for those of us who are working with children, families, adults, whatever it is, who have experienced trauma. And of course, sometimes we are also in harm's way, right? And so we cannot immerse ourselves that as part of our work, right, without being impacted by it in some way. But typically in our work environment, in graduate education, as we learn evidence-based practices or other kinds of interventions, nobody talks about this, right? It's really just, you know, you take care of that on your own. It's not part of our professional or educational work that we need to do together. But in fact, it really is, particularly when you start to talk about quality improvement and change agents. Okay, for some reason, my slide is not advancing, so let's see. There we go. Okay. So how does this relate to quality improvement? And there actually is a really significant tie-in, because as I was just saying, usually we don't talk about it. And so we don't understand really fully the cost to organization for having staff who are not at their best, right? They're either checked out, they're stressed out, they're overworked, they're not fully bought into the work that they're doing, right? They're not a full player in the team. And so when we think about best practice in organizations, my colleague Pat Fisher, who is part of the STS consortium and has written a number of books on this, on organizational change, she's up in Canada. She says the cornerstone of best practice is trauma-informed care, is provider wellness, right? Because if your staff are not well, your organization is not going to be fully functional. So what do we do about this? This is what we're going to talk about today together. I'm going to help you understand how we do self-assessment, right? We're going to talk a little bit about organizational assessment, but this is really focused more on the individual today, right? We want to encourage you to increase your capacity for mindful self-awareness of trauma reminders and your level of provider distress. We want to reduce your risk and enhance well-being. We want you to understand your risk factors and be able to identify and engage in practice strategies that will sustain optimal wellness. We want to increase your capacity when you notice that you are dysregulated to get back into your window of tolerance, right? To develop a set of practice skills for self-regulation in the moment and in the aftermath. So I love the slide. This is used to be me at the end of the week when I was doing a lot of clinical work in a community mental health setting, right? So what are your vulnerabilities? Well, one of them is caring. In order for us to do a really great job, we have to care about our job. We have to care about the people that we serve. Well, that caring is actually one of the ways that we experience risk, because the more we care, the more vulnerable we are to be impacted emotionally and otherwise by the work that we're doing, right? And so what's different about this kind of exposure is that this isn't something that just happens occasionally or to someone we know. This is part of our job. So you can almost consider it as an occupational hazard, right? So often when we talk, if you fly anywhere, you get on an airplane, they're going over the safety features and they say, if we experience an emergency, put on your own mask first. So this is kind of that idea, right? How do we take care of ourselves so that we are achieving optimal wellness so that we can serve others better, we can be more accessible to our friends and family, right? How can we increase our capacity to do that? One of the other issues that addresses the increase in risk for us is that most of the work we do is confidential. So we can't go home and talk about it. We usually, unless we're under supervision, don't have the space to talk about it with even a supervisor, because even our supervisors are mostly focused on administrative supervision, not self-reflective supervision, right? Who has time for that? You've got a zillion cases. And often if you bring that into supervision, people might see that as, well, are you meeting your productivity requirement? Are you doing a good enough job, right? It might raise a red flag. So there are actually greater chances, particularly with uh, early career professionals, not to bring that in because you're unsure if that's the right place to do it. So where do we go? How do you make sense of or manage your own trauma exposure at work at the end of the day? So we want to help you assess your own risk and develop a wellness plan, right? We've talked about what are your vulnerabilities. What do you do in advance of potentially difficult conversations to reduce the impact of challenging emotions and trauma responses? And so this can be related to trauma, but it can also be working in a stressful work environment. And I can't see your hands raised, but how many of you at times experience your work environment as stressful and challenging in and of itself, right? So this is another thing that is a vulnerability, because no matter how much we practice wellness, we may be working in an environment that is compromised or non-supportive. What strategies do you utilize in the moment? What if you're in a session and somebody reveals something really traumatic to you, a death or an assault or a traumatic experience, and you become very dysregulated, right? Maybe it triggers something that you experienced in your past. How do you manage that in the moment, right? You can't stop and walk out of the room. What do you do? We're going to talk about that more. What plan do you have for grounding after this difficult kind of experience? What kind of daily practices can you employ to build resilience? And it sounds like you're going to learn a bit about that at the zoo next month. I'm a little jealous I'm not going to be able to be there. What workplace policies and procedures are in place to support staff wellness? So we want to have this be a bottom-up and a top-down kind of learning here, right? So it's not just you in a bubble trying to improve your wellness, but you're also working with your organizational leaders. And for those of you who are administrators, I'm hoping that you can take away some of this information and be able to implement some of the policy strategies that we're going to talk about to improve the supportive nature of the work environment for your staff. So I want to jump in a little bit. There's so many different types of terminology, and we talk about secondary trauma and compassion fatigue and burnout and all these different things. So we have spent a lot of time over the last decade trying to tease those out, because the more that we know what it is, right, you have to name it to tame it. So as we can get a better sense of what these terms are, then you will be able to develop a better skill on what you need to practice self-care. So I want to talk a little bit about secondary traumatic stress, the natural and consequent behaviors and emotions resulting from knowing. So I want to pause there for a minute and talk about this idea of knowing. Knowing can mean reading a report, right? It could be taking a call and having to write something down. It could be somebody who works in records and just reads about a story, right? But never actually sees a client or a person. It can also be sitting in front of someone as they are telling you a really difficult story or disclosing some kind of trauma or child maltreatment or adult maltreatment for the first time, right? That's going to be a different level of knowing, where in the moment, as you're empathically engaged, your responses will be different, right? And then perhaps there's even another level of knowing. Perhaps you've experienced a similar kind of trauma yourself, maybe with a prior person or a different client, or maybe you're in your own background. So as you might begin to understand here, what I'm talking about is that this idea about secondary trauma and knowing it can have multiple levels. And the more that you're able to identify your source of dysregulation, if that's what your experience, or numbing, which is also possible, because that certainly is a really good strategy, right? To just shut everything down. It can help you to identify strategies to build resilience. So the behaviors and emotions resulting from knowing about a traumatized event from another person, the stress from helping or wanting to help a traumatized or stressed person, right? So this stress is another layer on top of the risk factors that we've already talked about, right? Because we can't always help everybody. Maybe somebody comes in and they're doing really good work and they disappear, right? Or maybe it's a custody situation and a child gets placed in a custody situation that you know is not safe or not the best place for a child. Or you're working with a kid in foster care and they're on their 10th placement, right? So understanding this level of stress and wanting to help, it's an additional layer of vulnerability for each of us. So this work is coming from Charles Figley. He was actually the kind of leader in this field in the 70s. He did quite a bit of work with faith practitioners and ministers who worked with Vietnam War veterans as they returned home. And so that's where a lot of this work started. And he's written a number of books. He's really a very insightful and brilliant leader in this work. And now I also want to just talk a little bit about vicarious traumatization. This is from Lorianne Perlman and Karen Satvicki's book. And they talk about vicarious traumatization as the cumulative effect of working with survivors of traumatic life events. Anyone who engages empathically with victims or survivors is vulnerable, right? So we're not talking about just one incident here. When we talk about vicarious trauma, it is building over time. And if you don't have some strategies to interrupt the cumulative effect, it can really take a toll over time. So again, you can look up some of their books. They also have some great resources. I really want to leave you as we go through this time together today with a lot of resources. So it's not just what I'm talking about, but maybe something strikes you and you want to follow up on it, to please be able to look up some of those other things. So aside from these two that I just mentioned, there's some other factors that can increase your vulnerability. Measuring self-worth by how much you help others. How many of us do that? Unrealistic expectations of yourself and the system, right? When we keep trying, but the system isn't functioning well. Systems aren't talking to each other well, right? And so it creates an increased level of stress. Self-criticism, perfectionism, fear of being seen or criticized by others if you show weakness, by seeking help for burnout, compassion fatigue, or decision fatigue. Reduced ability to give or receive emotional support, right? So sometimes we shut down, and again, because of the confidential nature of our work, we're often not able to reach out to friends or other folks because we can't talk about it. So I'm going to pause here and mention something that I think is really important. I'm going to put my organizational hat on for a second. So when we experience secondary traumatic stress, provider distress at work, what can we do at work? There's often not a lot of resources, but now because the DSM-5 actually lists secondary trauma or for first responders and others who aren't experiencing the trauma, but they're exposed to it, actually can receive a diagnosis of PTSD. That shouldn't always be good news, right? You don't want to have that diagnosis. But what that means as a worker is that if you are experiencing some post-traumatic stress symptoms, if you will, to the point where it's actually impairing your capacity to function, you should be able to go to an employee provider and get some support for that. So it's something to know, it's something to think about if you're an administrator. Do you even know if your EAP providers have even one referral person on their list who has any training at all in secondary traumatic stress? I love to go to EAP presentations and ask these questions because it's always no, we don't even know what that is. I love to do trainings for those kinds of folks because, you know, it's again, it's that top down and bottom up. We want to help our organizations create policies and procedures that are going to be more supportive for staff. So overextending yourself, overachieving, you know, so many of us, our systems do not have the resources they need. We're often, you know, it's like one more client or what, or this person's out and we need to cover that. So the system kind of sets us up for overextension. Letting work bleed over into your personal life, right? That can just, if you're stressed at work, what kind of strategies can you do to transition, right? Better to set those boundaries. There's a wonderful speaker. His name is Victor Lacerva. He's here in New Mexico. He's actually a pediatrician, but he does a lot of work in this area around self-care. And he said one of his strategies stuck for me for some reason back in the day when I was actually in an office. He said, when I would leave the office, I would go out the door, I would close it, I'd turn around, look at everything first, and I would say, stay. And then I would go home. And he said, just that little ritual actually helped me with my transition because I knew I'd be able to go back to work and pick it all up the next day. So again, when we talk about cumulative stress, we're often working in high trauma environments, right? We have compromised systems, ongoing work challenges and cutbacks. So if our work environment is controlled by different kinds of budgets, how often does that impact the stress from our job? Hostility and perceived or real threats. Sometimes we work in dangerous neighborhoods if we're doing work out in the field. If you're in social work, sometimes people have misperceptions of what you do and they see you as someone that just comes in and snatches children. So there can be many ways that our environment is not supportive even outside of our work environment. And then again, the difficult stories and losses that we may experience as part of our job. So here's an official definition of secondary traumatic stress. Results from exposure to trauma experienced by others, often in the workplace, with no real threat of personal harm. So this is a key here, right? So secondary trauma is different from direct exposure. We want to be sure that we're holding that in our mind. There is no real threat of personal harm, although often our neurophysiological response is acting as if we are under threat. Secondary trauma symptoms are often indistinguishable from those of direct exposure and may include nightmares, trauma cues and triggers, avoiding reminders, right? I don't want to see that client, or I don't want to go into that neighborhood, right? Or I don't want to go into that meeting. So we begin to avoid different kinds of reminders of stressful events. Numbing, shutting down, withdrawal, hypervigilance, trouble concentrating, being irritable or quick to anger. There's also a range of secondary traumatic stress responses. So when I do a presentation like this, there are always folks in the audience that go, this just doesn't apply to me. I don't feel stressed by my job. I'm doing fine. I really don't know what the point is. And that's okay, right? But I think that it's important to understand that there are a range of responses in any different given time. So what that means is that you're managing it really well. Whatever strategies you're employing, you're doing a great job at it. But I think it's important to understand that your ability to respond really changes over time, and that can happen day to day. So you can have no trauma symptoms, or you can have Maybe you have a bad session or a bad day or something's happening. Maybe you didn't sleep well. Maybe you have a few trauma symptoms, like you're hyper aroused or you're a little irritable or you're thinking about something when you don't want to, right? You're home with your family, but you're still thinking about a client. You can't quite shake the story that they told you, right? But there's no impaired functioning. You're still able to interact with your family and your friends. You're still able to do your job. You're really pretty much in good shape. And then we go up to the next level, you have trauma symptoms, and there is some functional impairment, but you don't have enough symptoms that you actually reach a PTSD diagnosis, right? So this might mean, I'm going to just go back for a second, maybe you're having nightmares, right? Maybe you're avoiding reminders, or you're hypervigilant, or you're having trouble concentrating, but you're not at a place where you actually need to step away from work. And this is where we talk about the quality improvement side. If you and your supervisor are not talking about these feelings in some way, how is your supervisor going to be able to support you? How are you going to be able to come in and go, you know what? I need some time off because I need to step away from this work. Or how can you go to your supervisor and say, not that case. I can't take that case. It's too triggering for me, right? In our organizations, do we have the capacity to do that? Most organizations, no, they're not quite there yet, but it's a conversation worth having, right? In NCTSN, we developed a gold standard for supervisorial competencies around secondary trauma. This is one of them. Are your staff able to come to you and say, I am feeling like I'm not able to do my job right now. I need to do what? What's in your policy, right? What are your staff able to do if they actually are moving toward having enough functional impairment based on their exposure to trauma cues that they need some time off, right? These are all kind of challenging and challenging questions, but this is how we tie into this sort of notion of this ripple effect and this quality improvement. Because if we don't even have that capacity for a supervisor and a staff member to have this conversation, right? How is that going to impact the quality of care that your clients receive in your organization? So here's another risk factor, right? Direct exposure and prior history. This is just a little quick survey that we did at the in New York, the Children's Trauma Institute. We asked some of the social workers, just on a normal day, right? How much direct exposure do you get on your job? So how many of them went into dangerous neighborhoods? Most of them. Witnessed drug abuse by a client, poverty and homelessness, physical abuse, educational neglect, poverty, lack of food, child maltreatment, right? So as you go down and look at this list all the way up to death of a client in some way, any of these ring true for you? And if that's so, do you have any capacity in your work environment to talk about the cumulative effect of this kind of exposure? We also talk about direct exposure not on the job, right? I think this is really important right now in this day and age when there are increases in climate disasters. There are increase in violent crimes and mass shootings. So you might live in an area or be in an environment, a community that has been impacted by this. So if your clients that you're seeing and you're supporting are also impacted by these kinds of things, what does that do for your well-being in terms of being somebody who is trying to support someone, but also being the victim yourself? I've done a considerable amount of work in this last year, and even in the last week when I was at IBAD in Hawaii, working with primarily educators on Maui following the fire in Lahaina, because most of these educators are not only trying to support their kids, like one of them said to me, you know, do I bring this up in the classroom? Well, first of all, we don't have a classroom because it burned down, but we have this makeshift classroom. Do I bring it up with the kids? What do I say when they ask me if I lost my house? I lost everything, right? So this is an example of direct exposure in a community where these educators are trying to take care of these kids. So where does that factor in terms of our vulnerabilities? And then many of us come to this field because we have our own lived experience, right? And in some ways, our own lived experience, whatever it is, can make us better at our job because we understand in a different way, but it also is an increased risk. So when we talk about direct exposure, prior history can also be a piece of that. Moral distress, I'm just going to talk about it briefly because it does come up and I think it's important to consider. This is when there are inconsistencies between our own beliefs about our work and what we want to do and our actions in practice, right? So maybe we want to do more for a kid who is in foster care or in the juvenile justice system or whatever it might be, but we aren't able to. And what we're able to do actually is inconsistent with our beliefs and our values about the work that we want to do, right? So we're going to do our job and we're going to do our best, but there sometimes can be this experience of moral distress, right? When your job is requiring to do things that you feel like might not actually be in the best interest of a child. An example that I'll give that I ran into often in community mental health would be when a child abuse report was made to child services and there was not enough evidence to substantiate the abuse, when our hunch and some of the evidence that we were getting was that this child was really not safe either at home or in a placement or whatever it was, but we were not able to do anything about it, right? Because Child Protective Services, they went out and did an investigation and there were no findings, right? So this actually creates another level of stress. Burnout. How many of you have experienced burnout or compassion fatigue? Actually, now we talk more about empathic strain because who wants to be fatigued about being compassionate? I don't know, that we didn't like the way that sat. So in our most current research, we actually refined that to talking about empathic strain. Burnout is a slightly different thing. Burnout is a state of emotional, mental, and physical exhaustion. So a little different than this trauma response. It's a sense of feeling hopeless and having difficult dealing with work or doing your job effectively. It feels like your efforts don't make a difference. It feels like this job is changing you into a different person. You don't know yourself. You have reduced feelings of personal accomplishment, often related to high workload or a non-supportive work environment, right? So again, think in your mind, how often have you just felt burnt out, like you just need a break? I'm going to just show you, I hope you can see this. Oh, you probably can't see me. Maybe you can just see my slides. If you can't see me, what I'm holding up is a little book called Fried, Why You Burn Out and How to Revive. This book is written by Joan Borisenko, and it's a little book. It's not very long. And she calls it an invitation to take your power back, right? So I love this book. I have done a lot of work with Joan over the years. She's a New York Times bestselling author with a number of her books. So if you want to just learn a little bit more about burnout, again, books called Fried, Why You're Burnout and How to Revive, Joan Borisenko. She's a great author, and it's a great way to learn a little bit more about this experience and what to do about it. So I want to talk a little bit more about some of the things that are reported that people experience when we're talking about this whole constellation of risk factors. Distancing, right? Maybe you don't want to go to work, or you distance yourself from your family, or maybe you have a client that's the same age as your own kids, and so you feel like you need to distance a little bit from that. Negative self-image, like you're not doing a good job, depression, sadness, over-emotionality, reduced ability to feel sympathy or empathy. Sometimes we get real cynical, right, or resentful of our clients. We can often have extreme emotions where we're quick to anger or sadness or be tearful when we feel like it's not quite appropriate. Dread of working with certain cases, feeling professional helplessness, depersonalization, like you're not yourself, poor boundaries, right? When we are staying too late, when we're going sort of above and beyond when maybe it's not appropriate, implicit bias, social injustice, all of those kinds of things can play into all of these things that we've been talking about. For many of us, though, we might not experience any of those emotional or psychological symptoms, but we're feeling some more, I'm going to say, kind of symptoms associated with chronic stress, like anxiety, sleep disturbance, headaches, abdominal issues, back pain, twitching, hives, mood swings, poor concentration, forgetfulness, hypertension, or cardiovascular disease. So I'm sure all of you have heard in terms of wellness strategies that stress, chronic stress, is not healthy for our bodies. And so all of these things that we've been talking about fall into this category as well. So I want to sort of wrap this up, this little bit that we've been talking about here, and look at this little cluster, right? So these are all the things that we've been talking about: moral distress, social contract, right? When we feel like what we're doing isn't aligned with our moral beliefs, traumatic grief and loss, disaster work, direct trauma exposure, trauma history, historical trauma, secondary trauma, empathic strain, vicarious trauma, workplace stress, implicit bias, microaggression. And, this isn't an all-day training. We have a limited amount of time, so I'm not able to go into all of these, but I just want to give you an idea. These are some of the vulnerabilities. And my point here is there isn't just one thing. And so you can't just point to one thing and say, well, this is what's going on. But sometimes you can. And so our capacity for self-assessment is really important if we're going to be able to employ some of these strategies for change. So I want to do just a quick little exercise here. I'm going to invite you to begin to do some reflective practice, increase your sense of self-awareness and self-assessment. So I want you to maybe take a piece of paper or just do it in your own mind. Consider each provider distress risk factor. Which factor or factors cause you the most distress right now? Be mindful of when and where this occurs. Does it happen in the present, when you're working, all the time, right? Creating ongoing low levels of underlying stress and burnout. So I'm going to just give you a minute to do this. And I want you to think through, right, kind of on a scale to 1 to 10, what is your highest risk factor? So if you're going to write that down, I'm going to give you a minute to do that. Just go around this little wheel. What pops out at you? You may already have been thinking about it as I talked about it earlier. What type of response do you experience? The avoidance, the hyperarousal, emotional dysregulation, numbing, physical problems. Again, if you have a piece of paper, just jot that down for you in the moment right now. And maybe it's nothing, and that's okay too. But perhaps it's something, or maybe it's multiple things. So this is step 1, right? We are taking some time, now that we've learned some of the terminology, to actually reflect on what is it that's getting to us right now. And I'm going to tell you that over time, if you come back to this exercise, it will change. There will be different things that pop out at you at different times. Begin to identify your patterns of vulnerability, the impact on your well-being, your clinical judgment, and the emotional capacity to do your best work, right? And then to loop this back to quality improvement, this is the key here. Are there patterns of vulnerability that get in the way of your clinical judgment and of your ability to do your best work? That's what we're trying to identify here. And then I want you to begin to think of effective strategies that promote self-regulation and wellness. What are you doing already, right? And why? Do you get up and take a walk? Do you spend time with friends? What is it? What is it that you're already doing? Because I can guarantee you, particularly those of you who've been in the field for a long time, have strategies that you utilize already to manage these things that we've been talking about. I'm going to move on, and we're going to talk a little bit more about now, what do we do? What do we do in the moment? What do we do in the workplace? And what can we do to enhance our capacity to build resilience over time? So I want to start with this notion of work-life balance, right? I'm going to argue that it really doesn't exist. So I'm going to say it's more of a dynamic kind of balance or movement rather than a balance. So there's all these different elements to what makes us up. And this is just a short list here. Our emotional well-being, our environment, our intellectual functioning, our physical health, spiritual practices, our relationships, our satisfaction at work, right? So when we think about that, how do we balance that? How do we know when one thing is being pulled in a direction that is not healthy or not supporting wellness? And so I want to set all the things that we've been talking about in the context of this larger work-life experience, right? Because this is just one piece of it. But I can guarantee you, if some of these vulnerabilities that we've been talking about are impacting you, it's going to affect every other aspect of your life. So I want to talk a little bit about, this is John Travis's work. He's the founder of the Wellness Associates. And he created, I love this, this image of the self-care gauge. And we want to talk about what are your warning signs, right? We've talked a lot about vulnerabilities and some of the things that get to us. So our wellness goals in life and for this training are achieving high levels of wellness, right? Our optimum level of wellness. In order to do that, that's constantly going to require us to find that balance, right? Find that neutral point and step into those things that support wellness, whether it's our physical well-being, exercise, nutrition, mental well-being, all of those things support high levels of wellness. But as we go in the other direction, we want to start thinking, what are our warning signs? How do we know we're moving towards the red zone, right? So these are some of the things that we want to start thinking about in terms of our own self-management, or if you're an organizational leader, what is happening in your organization to promote these high levels of wellness? Okay, so I want to take a minute here. I can't see you because we're not in the same room, but I'm going to invite everybody to stand up. I'm going to do it too, so that we're not sitting for so long. Maybe you're already standing. And I want you to just, kind of shake it off. Just move around, shake your body a little bit, stretch if you want to, and then stand on one foot and just hold it. Some of us are going to be able to do that really well. Some of us are going to feel really tippy. But I want to notice, as you're standing on one foot, probably you chose your strongest leg. So that's one strategy that you have. You might notice that you're using your arms, or maybe you're focusing in one particular spot to stay in balance. If I was in the room with you, I would walk around and I would push on people and try and knock them over a little bit, right? So that means that some vulnerability is, or something from the environment is impacting you to push you over. So your body compensates for that by working even harder to stay in one place, right? To hold that level of balance. And for each and every one of us, this process and this activity is different. Everybody does it in a slightly different way, right? The reason you chose one foot over the other, maybe you have an injury, or maybe you just feel stronger on one side. So why am I talking about this? Well, let's go back here, right? If we think about that neutral point, this is, and please take a seat if you're standing, or stretch a little more than sitting a long time, right? So if we think about this illness-wellness continuum and that neutral point, how do we in our life and in our work find that place of balance, right? And I love to do this activity not only so you can stand up and move around, and I get to too, but just as an illustration of how many elements inside your body were necessary to find that place of balance. And I think it's a good metaphor for these things that we're talking about. Okay, we're going to keep going. Here's another one of my favorite folks. This is Dr. Richard Davidson. He is the founder of the Center for Healthy Minds at University of Wisconsin at Madison. Now, Dr. Davidson is the guy, you may have heard of him. He's the one that did all of these studies with all the things attached to your head, the electrodes or whatever, with the Dalai Lama and with the people with his monks that support him. So he's done extensive research on the impact of meditation and mindfulness on our brains, which I think is really interesting. And what he says in a nutshell, the science behind, well, he says well-being is a skill. The science behind this fact makes a kinder, wiser, and more compassionate world possible. So again, do we usually think of well-being as a skill? I think it's a really interesting notion. He says, scientific evidence suggests that we can change our brains by cultivating habits of mind that will improve well-being, including happiness, resilience, compassion, and emotional balance. Each of these characteristics can be shaped and modified within our brain by experience and training. So these are some of the strategies that we're going to talk about now. And if you want to learn more, you can Google Center for Healthy Minds, and he's got a whole website about this kind of work. So step one, self-awareness. We've already been talking about that quite a bit until now. And we want to encourage you in many different ways, whether it's standing on one foot and having the self-awareness of what keeps you in balance and what doesn't, or just beginning to identify when you're experiencing some of these risk factors and where are you experiencing it and what are you doing, if anything, about it. So I love this cartoon. I'm a dog person. So, right, the dog is walking with its owner out on a walk, and in the dog's mind, they're in the present, they're in the moment, they're experiencing the sun, looking at the green trees, enjoying spring, right? But the human is full. The mind is full of thoughts and stresses and all kinds of things, right? And I think that this is really a good illustration of how mindfulness, being present in the moment, can help us calm down. And often we're not even aware that we have all this going on in our mind. So using mindfulness to support well-being, practices and rituals like the little one that I talked about, relaxation breathing, grounding skills. When we talk about grounding skills, we always want to incorporate all 5 senses. So sometimes we can do a grounding activity if we're upset by looking at something in the room and naming it, like a lamp or a window or a hat I have over there, right? So it's hard to do this naming without bringing yourself back into the present moment. Touch is a great way to ground, thinking about how the air feels, what's the temperature, things like that. Mindful movement is also really helpful. Sometimes just sitting and doing a mindfulness practice, people have a hard time doing that. So mindfulness can easily be taking your dog out for a walk and being present in the moment, right? It doesn't have to be just sitting on a pillow and focusing on your breath. There are many ways to do it. There's a number of apps that I love, and I use them all the time myself and with my kids. Calm is one of them. For those of you who are administrators, I know that Calm and Headspace will offer free registrations to their apps if you are doing community service work of any kind. So you can reach out to them, but they all have a free site as well. So Stop, Breathe, and Think is one that I like as well. One of the things that's helpful about that is it's not just focused on mindfulness and breathing, but also what's happening in your mind and what you're thinking, and how you can adapt what you're thinking to be more positive as opposed to more just sort of ruminating or anxious thoughts. And then orienting thoughts, right? Again, it's like being aware of any negative thinking or any rumination and shifting that to something positive. So Pema Chodron, who is a mindfulness teacher, says the key to mindfulness is to stay in the present. Don't get caught up in the hopes of what you'll achieve or how good your situation will be someday in the future. What you do right now is what matters. So in terms of thinking, this is actually a page from the Resilience Alliance workbook that is available on the NCTSN website. It's one of the resources that I will share towards the end, but they talk a lot about optimism. And it says, optimism is a skill of focusing on the positive without denying the negative, and channeling one's energy towards what is controllable. Optimistic people tend to have greater motivation, greater resilience, more positive moods, higher achievement, and a greater sense of control. They tend to feel and perform better, and they tend to have more positive relationships. So when we think about our thinking, again, the self-assessment piece, are our thoughts more hopeful and optimistic? And if not, what strategies do we use to shift into that perspective? And sometimes when we're in the face of a lot of challenges, that's really difficult, right? So something important to think about, what kinds of practice elements or skills do you develop? Where do you go with intention to evoke more optimism in your life? So I'd love to just take a little bit of a break. I've been talking for a lot. You've been listening a lot. Why don't we come back in about 5 minutes? So for me, it is 1:03. For you, I think it is 2. Why don't we come back at 10 minutes after? Let's do that. All right. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy your break, and we will reconvene in a few minutes.
Dr. Ross,
Mm-hmm.
just so you know, when we do come back, there is somebody with their hand up, but I'm not quite sure if that's a mistake or not. So I just thought I would just mention it. Gary Hoffman has his hand up, so I thought I would just
Thank you.
mention that. Mm-hmm.
That's a
Do you
mistake.
what?
It's a mistake? Okay. I just wanted to
Okay.
make sure we got to you if we needed to.
Okay, gosh, Gary, I was so interested in what question you might have had.
I'll think of something.
Okay, okay. All right. Well, I'm glad we didn't just leave you hanging. So how's it going, Amy?
You're doing a great job. This is
Okay.
wonderful material. It's exactly what I was hoping for. So it's great. Yes.
Okay.
So just keep
And
doing what you're doing.
okay. And the tech side?
The
Is okay?
tech side looks great. All the slides are advancing just great. We
Okay.
can see just when you were showing the book and stuff, we could see that book, no problem.
Okay.
You know, if you want me to, I can even maybe see if I can find a better picture of it and put it in the chat if you'd like.
Okay.
But
Okay.
that's something we can do later on too. Just like, what was
Well,
the author of the book again?
Joan Borysenko, Boryssenko. Joan.
Okay, I'll see if I
And
can throw it in the chat.
all the other resources actually have a picture in the slide, but I pulled hers out at the last minute and wanted to just mention it.
Okay, and so that is another thing that you might start getting from the participants. They'll start asking if they could have the slides. And so I know you and I had talked about that a little bit. And so if somebody does ask, just know that I'll send it out to everybody who put in
Okay.
their email address
I
in
don't-
the registration.
I don't mind at all. I mean, if people share it, as long as they hopefully give me credit, then I don't mind. I'd rather the information get out in the world than just be in my computer.
Okay. And that's completely up to you too. You know, so like I said, I have some speakers that do and some that would prefer not, which is great. That's fine.
So what I usually do is send it out as a handout,
Okay.
like a
Perfect.
like a PDF, you know, with the slides and the line kind of thing. Because that way people have all the information, but they don't, they're less likely to then just take the slides and
sure.
do the presentation.
That's perfect. And if you wanted to send that to me, then I'll just send it out to everybody.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay. I can do that.
Yeah. That question's gonna come up soon.
I know it always does.
You know, it does. Well, you have good resources, and so yeah. Okay, well, I don't want to take your break away. Maybe you need to stretch
I'm
your legs
fine.
too. Okay.
No, I'm fine.
So I am down in the basement, so that's why I never get to see what it is. But while we've been here, the sun has kind of just come through the window just a little bit, so I know it is a little sunny out there. So that makes me happy. We've been so gray here for so long.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's one of the things I love about Santa Fe. It has very harsh weather, like it's really intense, but the sun comes out almost every day.
Yeah, that would be so lovely.
And we're at over 7,000 feet, so
Yeah.
it's
Hey,
high.
Jane.
I'm Pam.
Hi.
I've been an MC3 change agent for how many years
84
now?
years. 84. It looks like.
No, you're exaggerating. I'm one of the original steering committee members of MC3, and I'm an administrator of a program and an agency, and I think this definitely applies to me as well. Even though I don't see clients, I feel responsible for,
Right.
the staff that I have. Yes. And I hear about their stories, and I hear about the people that we serve. And, I've had some recent contract funding changes, and I know how it's going to impact my staff. So I think it applies, the concepts that you are talking about apply to all of us,
Absolutely.
regardless of our position, and trying to be, I also teach Tai Chi, so I try and be very mindful of how, day-to-day life is impacting me, and how, trying to stay balanced, myself, to try and help others.
So you were great at that little balance activity.
I just had 4 hours of Tai Chi last night, and I'm doing like a double sword set, which causes you to be very balanced. So I'm like, yeah, but that could change at any moment. That's what changed.
It's such a great, sort of extension of the metaphor, because Tai Chi, in my mind, I haven't done a lot of it, but I've done some over the years. And the practice for me as a total novice is like, if you're not grounded and centered, even when you're on 2 feet, when you're doing Tai Chi, you can't do it. So it's such a great way to find that deep balance, I think.
Well, and it's interesting that the balance comes, from the sun, down to the earth, and the earth, so when people think of grounding, they think about your feet on the earth, but there's also celestial energies that are happening up above, that are also actually keeping you grounded as well.
Yes.
So it's kind of that yin and yang, of things, and about everything, on the earth, the trees that keep you grounded, the animals that keep you grounded, other, people. So it's that energies as well,
I love that.
feeling it from the sides, not just, so people think of grounding as ground, but it's more than that.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for that reminder. Well, it is time to come back together, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. And Pam, thank you so much for joining. I really appreciated your comments. All right, so here we go. So in terms of what do we do about this, right? How do we find that balance? So I love to talk about the 3 R's for me: recovery, resilience, and readiness. And what that means is to use some strategies that resonate with you to, if you're dysregulated, if you're having a hard time, if you're feeling this level of stress, what strategies can you employ to recover from that, right? To get, we often talk about the window of tolerance. And when we're in our window of tolerance, we're cool, calm, and connected. And when we get dysregulated, we either get hyper aroused, right? We have all those hyper arousal symptoms, or we get hypo aroused. So this notion of recovery is, what steps, small or large, in the moment or over time, do we need to take to return to that place of cool, calm, and connectedness? So that's the recovery part. What strategies do we need to use to build our resilience, right? So that we're anticipating maybe when we're going to be dysregulated, we have strategies that we can do before, so that when we experience that, it will have less of an impact, and then strategies that we can do in the workplace or afterwards that can continue to build resilience for us, to make us stronger, such that we are ready, right? And ready for what? whatever's next, the next client, the next meeting, going home to our families, but we're in that place of neutrality, right? We're cool, calm, we're connected, and we are ready for whatever is going to happen next. Instead of feeling overwhelmed or dysregulated or exhausted or any of these other feelings. So these 3 R's is what I like to keep in mind when I talk about some of these strategies, right? How do we recover? How are we building resilience such that we are ready for what's next? So some of the things that work are things like relaxation training, stress reduction techniques like exercise, yoga. One of our participants was saying that she teaches Tai Chi. That is an amazing way to get grounded and relax. And so we're going to talk a little bit about grounding. And I don't know how many of you jumped back on the presentation before we started, but she was making the point that grounding is not always in the ground. Right. But I love this image. Just looking at this for me makes me feel a little bit grounded, because that sensory experience of walking barefoot in the grass really brings me to that experience of what it feels like to connect with the ground. And as she was saying, grounding can also be paying attention to other things in your environment. Right. And so let's just take a moment and think about that and practice some of these grounding skills. So darn, missing a slide. So I'm going to just encourage you. So the startup for this activity is to take a moment and think about some experience that is causing you some distress. It can be a client. It could be, if you're a supervisor, a staff member that you're thinking about. It could even be a family member, but preferably something that is related to work that just has you a little bit stressed out. And so I want you to then, after you have that in mind, take a moment and notice which parts of the experience evoke a strong physical or emotional response in you. So we already talked about a lot of things, physical things, emotional responses. So when you bring that experience or that person or that thing to mind, just notice, where do you experience that in your body? So let's move forward from that. And as you're holding that in your mind, shift your attention to your physical responses. The quality of your breathing. Is it fast? Is it slow? Are you taking deep breaths? How about your heart rate? And it can be fast or slow, but are you even noticing the feeling of your feet on the ground or your back against your chair? A few deep breaths here may help you get grounded as you focus your attention on your physical sensations. What about your shoulders or any tension that you're feeling? Let's take a moment and take a deep breath in. And as you let it out, just let go of whatever those physical sensations are. Pay attention to your thoughts and your feelings. If your thoughts are racing, take another breath to slow them down. If you're feeling any emotional distress associated with this experience, right? What steps do you need to take to bring yourself back to this neutral emotional space that we were talking about? Feeling cool, calm, and connected. And just doing this very brief grounding activity might help you. It also might not be enough, right? So as we begin to think about these different strategies, just notice how you're feeling now. Are you feeling a little bit more relaxed? Are you feeling a little bit more grounded? Or is that experience, whatever that experience was, still kind of looming in your body and in your mind, right? And that might be the case. And so we want to think about, what other action do you need to take in order to bring yourself back into that sort of neutral place? So I love this too. This is David Suzuki. How you imagine the world determines how you live in it. So this is connected to what I was just talking about optimism, but it also has to do with mindfulness and what you're thinking. So part of mindfulness, if any of you have practiced it or tried it, what we want to do is focus on our breath. and notice when our mind, our monkey mind, sort of catches a hold and takes us away. And we can be thinking about how comfortable we are sitting, or the sound of the dog barking, or this experience that I just invited you to bring to mind, right? Or maybe you're having this negative self-talk that we often do, like I'm tired, or I'm not good enough, or I'm too anxious, or any of those things, ruminating on something that's distressing you, or you're just irritated with someone. Maybe you got in an argument, right? And so this capacity for mindfulness includes interrupting that, noticing it, and at the very least, letting it float away like a cloud, like in this image here. Just notice and just let it go. And then if you can, bring to mind something more positive, like the image of this flower, that will even take you further in terms of using your thinking to keep you in a positive space. So one of the people, and I'm sorry I don't have this resource written down because it's just too many. Amy's keeping track of this and is going to share with you. There's a researcher who I love her work. Her name is Kristin Neff, Kristin Neff. And Dr. Neff does research on self-compassion. She has a great website. She's got lots of books, but there's also a lot of guided meditations on her website. And the basic idea of her work is that we often are listening to our negative self-talk all the time, right? We have this little inner self voice here, maybe a little creature on our shoulder, constantly appraising the situation in a negative way. We're actually hardwired to do that, to think in a negative way. Most of the time, it is out of our awareness. So this mindful activity is actually bringing that, working to bring that into our awareness, and then encouraging this other little voice, more positive one, the voice of self-compassion, who talks to you as if they are your best friend. So like, gosh, that was really tough. Don't be so hard on yourself. Take it easy. Maybe we should take a day off, right? So, or even in this illustration here, it's like, it doesn't even have to be words. That evoking self-compassion can just be bringing to mind a positive image that fills you with joy. Downtime, right? Another image that just, I look at it, I take a deep breath. I feel relaxed just looking at that little puppy. So this is a big issue, actually, because when you are feeling stressed, when you're vulnerable to all these different things that we've been talking about, very often it impacts your sleep, right? And it can impact it in one of two ways. You're either tired all the time and you want to sleep all the time, or you just can't sleep. You wake up thinking about things, you can't get back to sleep, you're thinking about work. When I first started kind of exploring some of this was years ago, the president and founder of IVAT that I talked about, it was like 2 a.m, and we had been having some of these conversations about setting boundaries around work, right? I was awake, there was something coming up, and I thought, I'm going to just email him because I'm awake anyway, whatever, right? Is that going to help me go back to sleep, or is that going to make me more awake? It totally made me more awake. So I sent him the email about whatever it is, and lo and behold, he responds right away. And I'm like, what? Bob, what is happening? You should be sleeping. It's 2 a.m. He's like, well, you're the one that emailed me. So I don't know if you can relate to this, but it was a real practice for me as an organizational administrator, as a vice president at Children's Institute. It's so much on my plate, which I loved. I loved the work. But at 2 a.m, I was still thinking about my work. And so it really took a lot of practice for me to stop doing that. So now, when I wake up in the middle of the night and I'm having these thoughts and I want to do emails, I pull out my Calm app and I listen to a sleep story or some music that will help me go back to sleep. So with intention, take action to protect my sleep. Right. So this is the notion. Even, I had a colleague that I worked with many years ago, and every afternoon at 2 o'clock, he would take a nap. 20 minutes, that was it. It was a timer, right? But everybody knew 2 o'clock, you do not knock on his door. You'll be in big trouble. And that was one of his strategies. He knew that in the middle of the day, to do his best work, to be at his best, that he needed to rest. right? And so he had his little nap time, and we all knew about it. And since he was an administrator also, it set a culture in our work environment that sort of allowed for taking breaks and having time to rest. All right, so we've talked now about a number of different activities that you can try to enhance emotional regulation in the moment during the workday, and to establish some ongoing wellness practices. So we've talked about mindfulness, grounding, some breathing techniques. One of the things that you can find on the NCTSN website is a very short handout. It's only 2 pages, called PRN, which is Pause, Nourish, and Reset. And it's the same idea that we were just talking about, having a mindful moment, right? When you are really distressed or you are tired, to just pause and to do something that's nourishing and reset. I was actually talking with a colleague the other day, last Sunday. She's a social work, she's an early career professional. And she was saying she was having a really hard time. And the other day in the afternoon, she just decided she couldn't take it anymore. And she just left work. She said, I've never done this before. But she said, I knew that I was kind of at the end of my rope. I went and I took a walk. And then I went and visited my friend who had kittens. And I spent an hour with kittens, right? So we all have different things that nourish us. But for her, it was walk, kittens, and reset, right? And then she was ready to go back to work the next day. So how often do we allow ourselves these moments or these opportunities to reset? And as an organizational leader, how much do you encourage your staff or even allow for your staff to do something like that? So one of the reasons we were talking about it was because she was really worried about what was going to happen to her as a young professional when she went back to work, right? Was she going to get in trouble? Would they understand? What was the situation going to be? So we all know that movement and exercise is great for our health. It's definitely good for our emotional health. So that's always a good strategy, even if it's doing something as simple, like I always like to do when I do these longer trainings, as standing up and stretching or balancing or just doing some quick movement to engage your body can be helpful. So we talked a little bit about interrupting negative or distressing thinking and rumination. This is an entire practice and is not easy to do. And the more upset you are, the more intrusive those thoughts are, the harder it is, right? So there's something, I don't know, again, I don't know the breadth of the audience that I'm speaking to, but many of you, if you're not clinicians, maybe have heard of something called trauma-focused CBT. So trauma-focused cognitive behavioral health therapy was developed by Judy Cohen, Tony Manarino, and Esther Deblinger in 2004, actually, was when they first started doing training on it. And it's a great model. And the first part of it has to do with psychoeducation and relaxation training, and then some of the cognitive processing, right? Just to help reduce the reaction to these traumatic stress responses. And so a short while ago, I'm going to say within the last 5 years, Esther Deblinger created a model which she calls PRACT, which is the first part of the practice components for TFCBT. And so these practice components she is now using to train clinicians. So when they train clinicians how to do TFCBT, they're also training them on this self-care model. And it's basically encouraging them how to use these practice components for self-care. And again, you can look up Esther Deblinger and try and find that resource. But it is again something where we are taking some of the work that we do and using some of the cognitive processing and relaxation skills and other things to help ourselves as well. I talked a little bit about self-compassion with Kristen Neff's work, gratitude. We're going to talk a little bit about this in workplace strategies. We talk, Beth Stam and Charles Figley, who I talked about previously, developed a measure called the ProQual. It's the Professional Quality of Life Scale. And it measures secondary traumatic stress, it measures burnout, and it also measures something called compassion satisfaction. And that is how much you're getting out of your job. And part of what we know is that time on the job actually increases that. So if you've been doing this work for 10, 15, 20 or more years, you've probably figured out how to make it work, right? You've developed these strategies, whether you've thought about doing it or not, you have them. So compassion satisfaction has to do with feeling good about your work. And as an organizational leader or even an individual, if you can create opportunities on your team for successes and celebrating those, it can really go a long way for team building and to just feel better about your work, right? Because we are so focused on the problems and the issues and the negative situations and the difficult cases, we don't often set aside the time to talk about a case that really worked, right? How often do we do that? This is something that can be protective and can enhance wellness in our individually and in our work environment. Talked a little bit about downtime, wellness breaks, relaxation training. So all of these different activities are things that you can begin to integrate into your environment in small or large ways, whether you're just someone just coming out of graduate school and starting this work, or if you're an organizational leader that is responsible for everybody on your team. So let's do another little exercise together where we're going to be thinking about strengthening emotional regulation. So we have some activities here that can help manage emotional distress in the moment, right? So in the aftermath of a distressing experience, perhaps that one that you brought to mind, or that you've used over time to reduce traumatic stress and burnout, think about or write down on your little piece of paper of these things that we've talked about. What is a resource that you're already doing, right? What is something here that really works for you? And if you can list a few of them, then go ahead and do that, because that's going to be even better. So this is naming strategies that you are already doing, right? That you know that work for you. Because as you begin to develop your practice skills, if you can name them and begin to link them with some of the risk factors that we talked about earlier, it's going to jumpstart your ability to actively engage in enhancing your well-being. Remember that wellness gauge, right? We want to always be moving towards optimal levels of wellness. So when we're identifying our risk factors, which of these things can you begin to do that you're already doing to address those vulnerabilities? And if you've done that, I also want you to think about any of the things that we've talked about in this last little section that you think you want to try, that you've never done, right? Maybe you want to do that with a buddy. Maybe you want to try it on your own. But what sounds interesting to you? Taking a nap at 2 o'clock, going out for a walk, playing with kittens, doing some mindfulness activity, Kristen Neff's work on self-compassion. Think about a thing that you haven't tried that sounds interesting to you, that maybe by next Tuesday, you'll give it a try. Maybe even try it with your team. Okay, so trauma stewardship, trauma mastery. This is one of my colleagues who is funny and smart, and she has a TED Talk that is really funny because she describes herself like being on the brink of literally like thinking of jumping off a cliff and then realizing, I think I need to do something for an intervention. She ended up writing a book. It's a great book. It's called Trauma Stewardship, where she talks about her journey of trauma mastery. Now, this is, she's actually a social worker, and so she focuses some on that, but she also talks about anybody who might be exposed to trauma and is trying to develop these skills around trauma mastery. So Laura says, trauma stewardship is not simply an idea. It can be defined as a daily practice through which individuals, organizations, and societies tend to the hardship, pain, or trauma experienced by humans, other living beings, and our planet itself. So one of the reasons that I like to bring this to mind is that some of the stories she tells talks about working with conservationists and biologists who, by the very nature of their work, are documenting the extinction of species or the impact of some climate disasters on the well-being of communities. And I think many of us are experiencing that in some way. And so there can be like a low-lying, underlying anxiety around these increases in climate disasters and how they impact us and our communities. I'm going to say certainly the work I've done with the folks in Lahaina have impacted me. I moved here to Santa Fe, New Mexico in 2020, in part because I lived in a beautiful canyon with these huge trees, and for 3 years in a row had to evacuate due to wildfires. Now, I had lived there for decades and hadn't had that experience. And so there's sort of this underlying awareness at times of this kind of global change that is happening and how it's impacting us personally in our communities, but also with the communities that we serve. And so Laura's book, it's an epic journey, I'm going to tell you. It's a pretty long book, this long. But it's a great book to read over time. It has a lot of strategies. And again, if you just want the short version, you can look up her TED Talk on trauma stewardship, and I'm sure you would enjoy that as well. So what do we do to employ protective factors in the workplace? These are some of the strategies. How do we create support systems? This is something that can be really challenging. And as Amy mentioned at the beginning, I co-authored with my colleague, Jenny Sprang, and a bunch of us locked ourselves in a room in Denver, Colorado, 10 or 15 years ago, and hashed out these different elements of an organizational change approach to create a more STS-informed organization. I'm going to share with you how you can find that. But one of the things that you can begin to think about are what support systems need to be in place, like the EAP provider that I talked about, like this idea of being able to talk to a supervisor or administrator about some experiences you might be having related to workplace stress, right? Are there actual policies in your policy or your strategic planning at your organization? Do you talk about this? You know, the whole point of this talk is about quality improvement, right, in your organizations. So might you consider all of these things we've been talking about as a quality improvement issue to enhance the wellness of your staff and your organization so they can do their best work? Well, do you have any policies in place to do that? So this organizational change framework actually talks about some of the policies that you can bring into your organization to do that. So as we move around here, reflective secondary traumatic stress supervision. On the NCTSN website, there is a handout, supervisorial competencies for secondary traumatic stress. There's 9 of them. And it is a gold standard. It goes in depth into different strategies that supervisors can take. And then it also has a list of resources where you can go and learn more about that. My colleague, Jenny Sprang, and Amy, I can get this website to you after the presentation. Again, she's at University of Kentucky, and she oversees a child trauma center there. It's a Category 3 grant with SAMHSA, with NCTSN, but she also has another grant called the Secondary Traumatic Stress Innovations and Solutions Center. And if you can go to that link, she has this organizational assessment tool that I'm going to talk more about. You can take it. It will give you a score. It's free online right away. It's fun to do with your team because everybody has a different idea of what that means. But she also regularly provides trainings on these NCTSN secondary traumatic stress supervisorial competencies. I think there's one coming up in May. And again, these are all free trainings. But that's really important. How much are your supervisors doing supervision just as an administrator, or are they actually integrating some reflective practice around the impact of work on providers? This is, again, a quality improvement issue as well. We have psychological first aid. So on the NCTSN website, there's a free program. You could just Google in psychological first aid. Because this is how to respond to a critical incident. So as a supervisor, administrator, even an individual, some of these guidelines around psychological first aid, we can use in a critical incidents with our clients, but we can also use them in our organizations. Wellness practices, we talked about some of the apps that you can use to enhance your wellness practice. Not all of us are good at doing Tai Chi or mindfulness or any of those things, but some of these newer apps can really help to guide you in different ways on how to do that. Training and risk reduction, one of the things that we found in our research with the organization is that a training like this actually reduces the risk. So in the measure of organizational stress or secondary traumatic stress, those numbers go down when staff have this kind of a training and understand some of the risk factors and also some of the strategies that you can use to reduce those risk factors. Team building is really important. One of the things that we've done in the past in terms of bringing some of these activities into the workspace has to do with if you're having a staff meeting, maybe you invite a different person each week or each meeting to do a wellness activity, to research something and bring it into the group. And that can be so many different things. It doesn't just have to be mindfulness. It could be doing a gratitude walk or looking at a video of kittens. I mean, that sounds funny, but if it really engages the team in this process and it creates a culture in your work environment, so you're not just saying it's the individual's responsibility, right? We are doing this as a team. We're going to bring this work into our team meetings, and we're going to do it collaboratively. We've talked a little bit about Kristen Neff's work on Beth Stom's work on compassion satisfaction. And this is the idea of using vicarious resilience, right? When we are, which is actually a thing. There's people who, there's a measure on vicarious resilience, and there's people who've written books about that as well. But this is the idea that we feel good about our jobs. We feel good about the successes of our clients and our communities when things are going well. Are we creating a supportive work environment? My colleague, Ginny, early on when we were doing this work, she decided, I need to have a more supportive work environment for my staff. And so in the Child Trauma Center, she gave up one of the therapy rooms and invited her staff to do whatever they wanted. They could create any kind of wellness thing. So they put in a couch and cushions and they painted the walls and there was music and there was all these relaxation kind of things there. And there it was, ready for everybody to use. And over time, she noticed nobody used the room. So she was a little concerned about it. And so she, at a staff meeting said, nobody's using the room. Should we turn it back into a therapy room? And everybody said, no. Just the fact that it's there is helpful. We know that we can go whenever we want to. And just having the space actually creates a more supportive work environment. So some of the other things that can help in terms of a supportive work environment is to acknowledge that this work is actually needed, right? That it is a real thing. Because in a lot of our organizational administrative structures, we certainly don't include it in quality improvement, right? That it actually is a thing that organizations should be looking at. Okay, let's keep going. So here's something else that we can use in our organizations. And this here's another book. You can get it on Amazon, the Compassion Fatigue Workbook. This was written by another colleague who's part of the Secondary Traumatic Stress Consortium. She's also Canadian. She works with Pat. It's called the Compassion Fatigue Workbook. And in this book, she has an exercise and she talks about low impact processing. I was actually asked to review this book before it was published, and I loved the book. But I came to that chapter, and she in the chapter she talked about sliming. She said, "Don't slime people," and I'm like, "Really? Is that a professional term?" But I've grown to love it. And the idea is that do you need to share a lot of gory details if you need to debrief with a buddy about something that's really distressing? So again, we have those limits of confidentiality. So we can't take this work home with us. In fact, we can't talk much about it at all. So if you have a wellness buddy, someone that you know that you can go to talk about stuff, when you do that, you want to be sure that, number one, that you are aware that you need to do that, right? That you're not just in the hallway, at the water cooler, hanging out after work, and you just kind of, as Francoise would say, slime somebody with your distressing story. Right? So the self-awareness, again, that self-assessment is so important. You need to know that you feel like you need to talk to somebody about something that happened, right? Not a supervisor, but basically like a wellness buddy, partner that you can debrief with. So step 2, you need to go to them and say, I'm having a hard day. I just had a hard session. Something just happened. I really would like to talk about it. Is that okay? Do you have time? Will you do that? Right? Give them fair warning. And then get consent, right? That's not enough to just say, I'd like to talk to you about it. They get to say, you know, not right now. It's not a good time. I've had a stressful day. You know what? Maybe not ever, maybe never. Maybe I don't ever want to hear that story, right? So it's important to respect your colleagues. So if you do need to talk about something, to debrief and to get help with that, that you give them permission to say no, right? This is really great. It is a great thing to set up if you have interns or if you have trainees or practicum students, to set this up as a sort of a precedent of ways of communicating about things from the very get-go. And then step 4, we talk about low impact disclosure. You can get a lot of support from your colleagues without having to share photographs, details, recount horrible events, right? One of the things that I've done a lot of work on in this area, because I speak at a lot of conferences and I'm on a lot of planning committees for conferences and trainings, that I think it's so important to talk to presenters. Unless you're doing a presentation on forensic, right? Forensics, where you need the pictures and you need those details. Can you communicate information about trauma without increasing trauma inputs for your viewers? So that's the idea here. What can you do to make sure that the people in your environment that you're seeking help with, that you're protecting them as well? You don't need to increase their trauma inputs, right? You want to support them by respecting their space and reducing the amount of trauma information that you give to somebody else when you don't need to. And again, Francois' book, the Compassion Fatigue Workbook, has exercises. So that this idea of bringing an activity into your staff meeting, this is a great book for that. It's got all kinds of really good information and activities that you could do in a very short time. So I want to shift a little bit more now and talk more about organizational change to reduce secondary traumatic stress, compassion fatigue, and burnout. What can you do? Right? So these are some of the things that we know reduces the impact. So reduce caseloads of high trauma cases, right? So often the better people are at doing trauma work, the more cases they get. And in fact, if you as an organization spend a ton of money to have them trained in a trauma-focused intervention, they're going to get the most cases, right? So as an organization administrator, can you think through the policy of how do you reduce that caseload? Are there other activities? Are there other ways that folks can meet productivity requirements without having such a high dose of high trauma cases? So it's just a reorganization of the way that you think about training and case structure and case assignment. So are there adequate opportunities for your staff and administrators to process and debrief cases? Do you have secondary traumatic stress reflective practice supervision? Do you encourage your staff to have wellness buddies or bring in some of the work that I do is I go into high stress situations, usually virtually, and just create a space to do some secondary traumatic stress processing. It's particularly helpful when there's a critical incident, like a child is hurt or somebody is killed or something happens like that. Right? So are you building in your organization adequate opportunities to process? And if you're just an individual listening to this, and you don't have an organization, right? If you have independent practice or your organization is currently not doing any of these kinds of things, find other ways to bring it into your community, right? Can you create some community connections to do this kind of work? Explicitly acknowledge and measure staff job stress, compassion fatigue, and burnout. So on Ginny's website for the Secondary Traumatic Stress Innovations and Solutions Center, they have an assessment tab where you as an individual or you as an organization can have folks go in. There's a measure on secondary traumatic stress. There's a measure on moral distress. So there's a number of things that you can take. It will give you a score right away. Based on your score, it will give you a list of resources. So if you're highly stressed, then the resources are going to be different than if you are not impacted very much. So again, this is a resource that's all free. As an organizational leader, are you encouraging your staff to maybe do this on your own or creating an opportunity to talk about? One of the things that I will say, this is sort of touchy, at Children's Institute, we encourage staff to do the ProQual, the Professional Quality of Life Scale. And so we sent it out for people to do it as a group for a team, right? So we would have departments do it. And they would do it anonymously and we would get a group score. The reason we did that is because we wanted to know if there was high levels of stress, but we wanted to protect individuals' confidentiality, right? Because you don't need everybody to know if somebody's really having a hard time. So as an organization, how do you balance that, protecting the confidentiality of your staff while at the same time being able to take the pulse of your organization? It's a little bit tricky, but these are things that when you're starting to think about, what do I want to do in my organization? Or as an individual, what am I going to be able to bring to my organization? These are just some of the things to think about. Provide resources to reduce the impact, mental health services, peer support. So again, I mentioned earlier, one of my favorite things to do when I do organizational consulting is to talk about, do your employee providers, right, in your insurance companies, have any awareness of this field at all, right? So if one of the occupational hazards in your organization are these things that we're talking about, do your providers have any support for that, right? And in the past, we just didn't think about it, right? It's a new field. And as organizational leaders, when I do this coaching, it's like, no blame, no shame. We didn't know it was a thing, but we do now. And so it's important as organizational leaders or as individuals that we talk about, do we have that? And if we don't have that for EAP providers, is there a consultant? Is there what is available in our community or in our state or in our organization where we can address this need? Right. And so some of the ways to do that is on a lower level. So it's having peer support, right? So you can have peer support. There's structured peer support kinds of things that you can do around STS. Do you have a buddy system? Do you have some of these things in place where you have supervision or this low impact processing that I just talked about, where you are providing resources for your staff, that you're acknowledging, explicitly acknowledging that this is something that happens at your organization? Do you provide training and organizational support of wellness practices like we're talking about? This can go too far. I was doing some training for a child welfare organization, a large organization in Los Angeles, and I was training supervisors. And so one of the supervisors would have go over the loudspeaker in the entire building. It was a really big building. Okay, everybody has to take their lunch break now and go attend this yoga training for reducing secondary trauma. People didn't want to do it, right? They wanted to go have lunch. So you can't go to the opposite extreme and require that, it's not a one size fits all. So you have to, again, find what works for your organization or for you as an individual. But I think it's important to just think about and to bring into a conversation and allow your organization to talk about what they think would work in order to create this change. And then allow for open communication with organizational leaders about the importance of reducing the risk, right? So if you're an individual and you're participating in this training, what can you do to go back? Can you talk to someone in your organization, in your administration about these ideas, right? What would their reaction be? And so I think one of the things I always encourage people to do, whether you're an administrator or just a graduate student starting to work, is to just open the door for the conversation, right? People start pointing fingers and then it gets really difficult because there are so many policy financial. I mean, there's so many different things at play here when you start talking in organizations that it's really important to just agree to have open communication about it, right? Like, where can you begin? I often encourage organizations, what can you do by next Tuesday? What's that low-hanging fruit that would allow people to feel like they're taking the next step? And then what is that one thing that would be the biggest bang for your buck, right? It might take longer, but what is one thing that we've talked about today that you could bring to your organization that you think would have the biggest change? Is it around supervision? Is it around trauma training? What would it be? So this is, so here it is. I'm glad I had it on this slide. On the bottom of this slide is the University of Kentucky's Secondary Traumatic Stress Innovations and Solutions Center. The website is at the bottom there. So this is the organizational assessment that we developed. It's called the Secondary Traumatic Stress Informed Organizational Assessment Tool, or the STSSI-OA. And as I said, you can go to this link and anybody can take it, and it's free, and it will give you a score. And it's fun to take it over time because you can see things changing over time, which I really like. So we have these 5 domains, and we've actually talked about these already today. Knowledge building and developing practice. So the idea here, whether you're an individual, an organization, is to learn more, right? To begin to understand this area better, to begin to think through how these ideas around these vulnerabilities and risk factors impact quality improvement, right? And organizational functioning and the wellness of your staff. As change agents, this is key, right? How do you change both individually and your organization to improve the quality of your organization? So we have secondary traumatic stress informed outcome evaluation and monitoring. That's what this assessment tool does. Caseload planning and supervision, we've talked about that already. Staff wellness and resilience activities. Do you have any of those even built into your organization? Organizational leadership, policy, and procedures. So one of the things that I do quite often in this kind of consulting work is do this kind of a presentation for organizational leaders and their board of trustees, right? Because sometimes organizational leaders might be on board, but their board of trustees is like, what are you talking about? We don't have the money to do this. So if you can get your board on board, then they often will go out and raise money. Or I have one organization that I worked with, and what they wanted in their break room was a massage chair, right? And with music. And so they got their board on board and they raised money. In fact, one of the board members actually had one in their garage that they donated to the staff room. There was like a private room that they could go to. So you can get really creative, but I think it's very important for organizational change to happen. And if you're talking about this quality improvement, that you get your leaders on board. What does your organization need to do? So there's a couple of things. Assessment is key, just like with individuals. If you don't assess the strengths of your organization, and probably there's things that you're already doing. So let's start with those. Let's enhance those. Let's focus on that, right? But what are the things where you're doing nothing, right? So when we talk about organizational change or implementation science, there's usually an assessment phase where you figure out what's working and what's not working. You come up with strategies that you can test and that you can try. You come up with an implementation plan or a strategic plan, and then you measure when that's fully implemented, right? So that's the assessment strategies. And then you move into implementation and policy, right? And then you focus on organizational collaboration and buy-in. Because if there's any part of the organization that's not on board, it's not really going to get rolled out effectively. Okay, so here's another strategy for you. This is also on the NCTSN website, or here's a direct link to it. It's called the Resilience Alliance, and it's promoting resilience and reducing STS among child welfare staff. But I'm going to say the strategies in here will work for any organization. It's just a short little workbook. Again, it's free. You can just download it. There's an implementation manual. and a facilitator's guide, all for free on the NCTSN website. And so this is one of the activities, right, that we had talked about before in terms of that wellness monitor. In here, we're thinking about our reactivity color zone. Be cool, monitor your heat level, or we're talking about the window of tolerance. When are you moving out of that place of being cool, calm, and connected, and you're being more reactive to what's happening? And then how do you move yourself back into that place of being regulated? So great resource. You'll be able to get this after, I think, that anybody who wants the slides, we're going to make a PDF of this and you'll be able to get them. So what are your wellness goals, right? Our wellness goals have to do with enhancing coping strategies, grounding tools in order to manage potential trauma triggers while increasing a sense of self-regulation and emotional balance. And I know that that's a mouthful, but that's what we've been talking about today. This is what this entire training is about, right? And so whether you're thinking about your own individual wellness or we're going back to being change agents to improve organizational wellness, right, or quality improvement, all of these things need to be taken into consideration, right? So whether you're thinking about enhancing coping strategies as an individual or an organization, they're related. The grounding tools, the wellness activities, how to manage potential trauma triggers in the workplace is really important. Again, this work, doing trauma work, brings with it an occupational hazard of all of these risk factors that we've talked about. But there are some research-based, evidence-based strategies that you can use in your organization or as an individual to promote wellness so that even in the face of this hard work, you are protected and you stay in a place where you're functioning well, right? You can think about other kinds of industries, right? If you're a construction worker, you got to wear a hard hat, right? Because they're thinking about staff wellness. If you're an airline pilot, there's only so many hours that you're allowed to be flying before you're grounded, right? This has to do with acknowledging that there's an occupational hazard associated with their work. And there are proven strategies to address that, to reduce the impact, right? And to create more wellness and more protective factors or enhancing organizational wellness. So these are the supervisorial competencies that I was talking about. This is what it looks like on the NCTSN website. Again, I mentioned earlier that there's actually a training coming up in May that's being put on through University of Kentucky, the Innovations and Solutions Center. There's the website for that. There's that and a number of other training events that are listed there. Quality supervision is an important protective factor in reducing and managing secondary traumatic stress in organizations. So these, I also want to really reiterate that these competencies are a tool that you can use as a benchmark, right? Because when people read them, it's like, nobody can do all that. And it's true, it's a lot, but we tried to think of every single thing that we could think of to really enhance this for supervisors. So it is a tool that you can, just like the organizational assessment tool, that you can do an assessment, see what you're doing and see what you want to build on over time, right? Like, are there some things that would be easy to do that you could implement pretty quickly, and maybe other things that might take longer? There also on the NCTSN website a number of resources. I included this. I think all of you got the secondary traumatic stress fact sheet. This is really helpful if in your organization or in your team, people haven't ever heard of this. It kind of just gives an overview like we did at the beginning of what it is and who it impacts and just some strategies and resources. There's also a series of webinars, if that is, people can relate to that better on the website. There's also fact sheets that are targeting specific types of providers like juvenile justice, child welfare, etc. So there's this and a number of other things available. So if you go to nctsn.org and you type into the search just secondary traumatic stress, it will take you to the STS page where you will find all kinds of resources. But again, many of those, because Ginny and I have been doing this work so long together, many of those tools she has now enhanced, and they're available on her website at the STS Innovations and Solutions Center. So I would encourage you to go to both sites. I actually retired in January from UCLA, so I'm no longer part of all that work there, but I still feels very much a part of what I'm doing. Okay, so what is next for you? So I'd like to just take a few minutes, and maybe we're coming close to the end. Maybe we might want to even take a little bit of time when we think about these questions at the end, and maybe we might have a couple minutes where you could write in the chat and share some of your ideas about this. But think about, what can you do in the moment? What have you learned today? Or what things are you already doing that you can utilize when you're in a moment of distress, right? And it doesn't matter where that is. Maybe you're waking up in the middle of the night and you can't go back to sleep because you're kind of ruminating about something that happened at work or happened with a case. What do you do in that moment, right? Do you use an app to try and help you go back to sleep? Do you do some journal? Like, what is it? What are your strategies that you have in your toolkit that you can do in a moment when you experience some of the things on that constellation of risk factors? What strategies need to be implemented in your workplace? And when I talk about that, that ranges from maybe you going in and trying to find a wellness buddy, or in a staff meeting, doing a mindfulness activity or a wellness activity, all the way to you're going to take that organizational assessment tool to your organizational leaders and see if they will do a whole organizational change process, right? And everything in between. So some people in their organization will just bring a presentation like this to their organizational leadership team, or maybe just to their program to get the ball rolling so people can begin to have a deeper understanding of what we're talking about. So think about that. What are a couple of strategies that you think you can actually do in your workplace to get started? So often we have trainings like this, and people get very enthusiastic and they learn a lot of stuff and they get all these resources, and then life sweeps us off when we kind of drift away from it. And so I always encourage everybody, when we're doing a training like this, to think about, what could you do immediately? Like, as soon as you go back to work, what is one thing that you would do, right? Or a few things. And then what are some other things that might take a little bit more work, right? Because if we don't start thinking right away about how we might use this information, very quickly it kind of drifts out of our awareness, and we don't get to take advantage of the work. What daily practice can you commit to in order to increase wellness and reduce stress at home and at work? So the key word here is commit, right? Just like I said, we get all excited about a training like this. We have so many ideas, and then life gets in the way. So one of the things that I learned early in my training from one of my mentors as a psychologist was something called a goal attainment scale. Maybe many of you probably know what this is, but I loved it because my professor said you have to adjust the goal to your capacity to attain it, right? And if you think about, losing weight, whatever, or exercising, you want to exercise, your doctor is telling you that you need to lose weight, you need to exercise 7 days a week for 30 minutes, right? And so you get on your bike or you're hiking or whatever you're doing, and after 2 weeks, you're doing it once a week, right? You're not able to do it. And so maybe if you adjust the attainment scale, it will be easier. So instead of 30 minutes, 7 days a week, maybe you do 20 minutes, 3 days a week, or 5 days a week, and see if you can do that, right? If you still can't do it, then you need to shrink it down even more. So maybe it's 15 minutes every other day. And you find that you can do that. And you find that maybe after a week, you're on it. You can totally attain that goal. And if you're able to do that, then you keep doing it, and you'll actually want to build on it. And after some time, you go, well, I can do this every day, right? It's only 15 minutes. And then maybe you build a 30 minutes. So it's being flexible in your expectation. And the same thing applies here. When we're talking about wellness, whether it's in an organization or individually, you want to be flexible, but you want to be sure that you're choosing something that you can commit to, right? What can you actually do? And if you try it and it doesn't work, then course correct, right? So that attainment goal needs to be something that you can actually do, because then it becomes self-motivating. And I love to close with this. This is Rick Hansen is another one of my favorite neuropsychologists who does a lot of work around how to use your brain to do this work, all the things that we've been talking about. He has a free newsletter. It's an e-newsletter and a book called Just One Thing. And in the newsletter, it suggests a simple practice each week that will bring you more joy, more fulfilling relationships, and more peace of mind. Peace of mind and heart. This is the link here. And this could also be something that you bring either to yourself or into your organization, like into a staff meeting or with a wellness buddy. And what I love what he says about this, and I think that it's really true. A small thing repeated each day adds up over time to produce big results. A small thing that's in your power to do in a world in which so many things are not. Just one small thing that could change your life. So here's some of the resources that I will share with you. And that is it for me. Here's my contact information. And again, the NCTSN website there. And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. I always like to end a little bit early because then everybody's really happy instead of going over. But I would like to take a few minutes. I'm gonna stop sharing. And maybe in the chat, because there's so many of you, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about some of those questions. So what are some of the strategies that work for you? What are some of the things that you think that you might try after this training that you've never tried before, but you think might work for you or for your organization?
And Dr. Ross, is it okay if I say just a couple of things?
Please, and Amy, I also want to just remind you that we're recording. Do you want to record this part, or do you want to end the recording now?
We can record this part, but I can
Okay.
actually end too, because sometimes people have questions that might pertain to somebody else who's listening in later. But I did just want to say thank you for joining us, because it was a stellar presentation with lots of resources and different things to chew on. So thank you so very much. The second thing, Dr. Ross has given us permission to have her slides in a PDF version. I don't have them right now, but she is going to transfer those and then get them to me. If you put a viable email when you registered into that link, then you will receive it along with the link for the certificate of attendance. The certificate of attendance also you will find in the chat today. The way that it works, if you haven't ever used it before, is that you go into the link, you fill out the questions about the presentation today, and then it will prompt you to another link. That is your certificate of attendance, and you can screenshot it, you can download it, you can save it, you can send it to your supervisor. It's yours to do with what you want. And so the link will go in the chat now. But for those of you who'd like to stay and ask questions and join us for the rest of the meeting, that would be appreciated. Thank you so much. So once again, thank you, Dr. Ross. It was wonderful.
I'm so glad that it was helpful, and I would really be interested if you're willing to take some time to drop into the chat box. Just your reactions to this training. Was it helpful? What did you gain something from it? And then any of those strategies would be wonderful to hear about too, especially the ones that you think are new to you that you want to try. And Amy, I can't see the chat, so if you could, oh, maybe I can. Let's see. Oh, good. Okay.
I'll put in the link and that
I
for the
got it.
certificate of attendance. Oh, you do? Okay.
I got it. Except it oh, like you said, it keeps moving. Oh, well, it looks like people enjoyed it. I'm so happy. I'm going to just say that I am really upset. And Amy, next time, I want to go present at the zoo.
Well, okay.
I feel like I'm
You're
missing
on.
out here on the whole zoo presentation experience.
Well, so there's two different places that we can go within the zoo. One where it's called the Peck Center, and that's where the attendees can get actually into the zoo, and then they have full range of the zoo once we're done with the presentation. So that's always, or even before. The Zoofari, unfortunately, where we're going next month, won't be in the zoo. So there won't be that, you won't be able to,
Sounds
yeah.
like fun. Okay,
It
I
is
see a
fun.
question. I see a question from
Oh.
Pamela about the ProQual. So Pamela, you can just Google ProQual. It's PROQOL, not QU, and it's Beth Stom and Charles Figley. You can take it for free on their website, but again, all you have to do is type in ProQual. Even if you misspell it, it'll come up because they use that quite a bit in the military. So thousands and thousands and thousands of people have taken it. So it's pretty widely used and easy to get. And it also will give you a score on those. And it's interesting to do it multiple times or as a team to see how it changes over time. Let's see what else.
Well, and we have been, as an agency, just looking at different assessment tools of, our staff in terms of, assessing their satisfaction and, so we're in the process of doing that. We just changed to a different tool, but this looks like a really cool tool. So
I would encourage you, Pamela, to go to the University of Kentucky. I know it's a long thing. University of Kentucky Secondary Traumatic Stress Innovations and Solutions Center, because on there they have a tab with assessments. Any of your
Okay.
staff, anybody can go take it. You can do it as a group. We'll give you a score right away, and we'll give you a lot of resources. So what's unique about it and what is great that Jenny has done is put it up on the website so that it's available for anybody. But there's the STS, Brian Bride's STS measure, the moral distress measure, the organizational assessment, the supervisorial competencies, all of it's there. So that would be a great place to explore. Let's see what else.
thank you.
And I did drop that certificate of attendance in the link.
Oh, there it is. So Miles, I would really like your comment where you were saying this type of presentation causes some excitement for change, but the implementation portion is what can be tougher. I agree that just small daily changes do add up when it's practiced routinely. And as somebody who has been an organizational change supporter and coach, I know how hard that is. And that's why, I apologize for all the resources, but it's kind of why I throw everything and the kitchen sink in, because it is so hard to get our organizations to engage in this work. And I empathize with that as an organizational leader. It is really hard to get kind of your foot in the door to begin to change policies to make some of these things work. So I appreciate your comment. Also, I'm just going to, say that I'm not sure, Amy, how you found me, but I do a lot of these trainings for small organizations or teams. So if you feel like a shorter version or a longer version, sometimes I do day-long trainings for organization, like staff retreats is really fun. I'm available to do that if it would support.
Yeah, something,
Amy, how did you
of.
find me?
So one of our and I'm wondering even if she's on today, one of my colleagues saw you, and I can't remember, I'd have to look back on her email where exactly she saw you. Her name is Maria Altadonna, and she wrote to me and said, I see that this is your theme for next year, the ripple effect, and I have something for you. And
Oh,
it's
good.
important that you bring Dr. Ross. And so I got on the phone with you right away. And so the two of you, my goodness, we talked I mean, I think back in November or something.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, that's kind of how it happens. So
Yeah.
I just want to say that I love doing this work because it's hard to get it out there and there's not a lot of people doing it. But because of the work in the network and all the things that Ginny and myself and our teams created, I have a lot of experience. And so I'm really excited to be able to share it.
Yeah, it really was powerful. Thank you so very much. And it was what I was looking for too. Sometimes so I'm no longer face to face with consumers, and but I remember, you never forget the day and then the day out. And I was in home, so I did in-home services, and so what was difficult for me at the time was taking it away, just knowing what I was leaving behind, So it wasn't meeting people in their offices, it was actually going into the homes. And there were sometimes it was hard to sleep sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. And, I think the other thing that I'm grateful for over the many years of doing this work is that we're now talking about it.
Yeah.
It used to just be, you can't sleep. Well, suck it up, Buttercup.
Yeah. You signed up
Right?
for this. This is what
Yeah.
you wanted to
Yeah.
do, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And I think this notion that we came up with early on about this work includes occupational hazards that we as individuals and organizations need to integrate into their practice and training is a totally new concept.
Well, and what I found too so interesting when I shifted over to a different job was that I didn't know that I was experiencing secondary trauma. I had no idea because I wasn't recognizing the symptoms as that. This kind of burnout, or maybe not wanting to go to work, or maybe a cantankerous, right,
Yeah,
in my
yeah.
position, or being kind of snippy with my coworkers. I didn't know that, or procrastinating my notes. I didn't know that those were all
Right,
possible things of secondary trauma.
right. Well, none of us did. So you're not
Yeah.
alone. Someone is asking you to send a link again for the survey.
Oh, sure.
Any other questions? We have a couple more minutes. Questions, comments, something you're excited to try?
My favorite thing was don't slime. No
Right?
sliming.
I'm like Francoise, really? Sliming? What is that? But everybody else loves it.
I love it.
Amy, you should get the book.
I
It's a good book.
I can't wait to get your PDF version to get all these resources. To be honest, I'm going to start looking at all of them. So, okay, well, whenever you send that over to me, I'll send it out to the big crowd. And so they'll be looking for that. But folks, if you don't have any more questions for Dr. Ross, I think we could let her go and then wish everybody a happy Wednesday. What do you all think about that? I don't hear any
Okay.
complaints.
Okay.
Thank
Amy,
you
thank
so
you.
much, Dr. Ross. Thank
You're
you.
so welcome. Thank you all for joining. And Amy, it's been really fun working with you and talking with
too.
you and chatting with you. And thank you so much for reaching out. I'm really glad that it was what you were looking for. And I will go ahead and send the PowerPoint to you and let me know if there's anything
and
else
I
you
do
need.
have a couple of billing questions, so let's reach out just the next couple of days to each other.
Okay.
Does that sound good?
Okay. Yep.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Great. Okay.
Thank you so much,
Wonderful.
everybody. Take care.
Happy
Bye,
Wednesday.
everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
See you next month at the zoo. Well, outside of the zoo. How you doing, Mary?
Oh, I'm doing, whoop, I'm here.
Okay.
Where did I go? There I am. I'm finished. I'm doing, it's long days.
Yeah. Yeah. Hi, Sabrina. I think you're on mute.
Did you finish your book?
Me?
Did I?
Did you finish your book?